Okay, so welcome to the User Adoption Podcast. I'm Tony Phillips from Cloud Design Box, and this is our weekly podcast where I speak to leaders who've driven user adoption in education. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Darren, who's going to introduce this week's guest. So over to you, Darren.
We're very happy to have with us today Jonathan Bishop, who's head teacher of the Cornerstone Academy Trust. We've worked with Jonathan and his colleagues for a number of years on the schools that make up the trust, principally Broadclist and Westclist, and there are more schools coming on board in the future. But we're now starting to work with the Cornerstone Trust as a whole. Jonathan, welcome.
Pleased to be with you both.
So I'd like to lead straight into the questions. One of the things that we've worked on a lot with you over the years is Class Notebook. So Broadclist Academy has been using Class Notebook with students for several years. Can you tell us what has been the impact of the approach of using Class Notebook for students and especially for the younger years?
Yeah, I guess a bit of context just for your listeners. The school has got 500 children. We've got a nursery, so we take children from age 2 through to 11. And we've provided a lot of one-to-one access to devices. We've bought a lot of Surface technology. So we've got hundreds of Surface tablets, and all of the children are working within Office 365. But fundamentally, OneNote has been the tool that has empowered both teachers in their teaching and learning. So a teacher with a Surface would be using digital ink to write into Microsoft OneNote into the class notebook, and that becomes their whiteboard, and then they wirelessly project that onto the screens, and the content is synchronized via the cloud down to the tablet devices of the children. So what this has done is empowered access to those learning resources that the teachers are making available in advance of lessons from home. Obviously, during the lesson, when the teacher is teaching, pulling up those resources and digital linking over them. And then if they go into breakout groups, breakout sessions elsewhere in the school, you almost take that content with you from the lesson input you've just had to work in smaller groups on targeted projects. But then back at home later that night, you're able to pick up on the things that you were doing at school in a seamless way. So Class OneNote has allowed teachers to work very collaboratively on preparing resources. You don't save them, you don't upload them, you don't particularly have to assign them in that sense. These are the learning resources mapped to their daily plans. So working with yourselves, we've then configured the notebooks into different zones. The first zone is around the teacher content that I've been talking about. And that's read only to the students, but the teachers can be, as they're planning their lessons together, they are uploading that content. It's immediately available. Then you've got the zone, which is the collaborative zone, where you've got projects that are ongoing, that they can be working together as teams of children on that project. Again, digital linking, uploading their ideas to the class notebook. And then you've got the personal area. So the teacher can see all of the children's personal areas, but the child only sees their own. And into that personal area, we're putting targets, we're putting examples of good work, and teachers can push content to that area in every single child that they work on, and then can retrieve that content to review it and mark it and work on it. So the impact for us it totally underpins planning, teaching, and the engagement in lessons, before lessons, after lessons by the students. It is the one fundamental tool within Office 365 that is supporting our whole curriculum delivery.
Awesome. One comment that's sometimes made is that that's all very well, and it will work in secondary schools, but it's not appropriate for primaries. Where would you say you would draw the line? At what age would you think that it is reasonable for students to start working in things like the class notebooks?
Well, we're using the class notebooks at every age, so in our nursery, reception, all the way through to year 6. And so I don't think age is a barrier, but how you work in that notebook, of course, will change. So if you're pushing some content where it's got some activities on the page where children are going to be carrying on with those activities, reviewing their targets, clearly a 2-year-old, that's not appropriate for. So you've got to have the use in an age-appropriate way, or even more importantly, a stage-appropriate way. So reading and writing, as they're developing those skills, you are going to engage in the notebook in a different way the more independent and avid a reader and competent a writer you are. But in the nursery, we can still put lots of content. They can still take that content up onto a screen in the room if they're sharing it, or onto individual devices where that group in the continuous provision are going to engage in that activity, and it's on OneNote. What that does mean is when the parent at home wants to support their child and says, I wonder what you're going to be learning at school today, or the archetypal parent question, what did you do at school today? And all children go, nothing. I went out to play. Actually, you can have a meaningful question, can't you? Because as a parent, you can say, I see you've been in the garden today looking for butterflies. Shall we just watch this video clip together? So by embedding resources that are media rich with clear stepped instructions that a parent could understand and work with their child on, then young children can be engaging through OneNote with school, with their parents.
Great. What's your view on writing, handwriting? Because obviously once you get to kind of year 1, year 2, you're starting really to do proper handwriting, and you're perhaps starting to think about joined up. What's your view against writing on paper in exercise books compared to writing perhaps on your Surface Pros using notebook? Do you think you lose something in the learning of how to write if you're doing it using a stylus and inking?
I think the answer is, from a genuine answer from me is there's a lot of mixed feelings and emotions generally about handwriting and digital inking. And I don't think it's really a polarized view of right or wrong or all or nothing. So, we would, of course, be wanting active participation through play in the very young years, picking up pencils, mark making, through to teaching them to write. A handwriting scheme is not wrong. Having lovely, beautiful handwriting is an aspiration of many. However, the skills of the future are changing, aren't they? So artificial intelligence, not just voice dictation as we used to call it, but that idea of having a personal assistant talking to your computer, getting responses. It's real on your phone, on your Kindle, or whatever it is in your house. To say, do you lose something? No, you're gaining something, but it doesn't necessarily replace a traditional skill of learning to write. Whether one day it will, well, we can all crystal ball gaze at the pace of technological advancement. So for me, what you're doing is preparing children for the world that they're entering. And so you need to be learning these new skills, not just saying they've replaced the old, but sitting them alongside, complementing them. Now, I did, if you want to be slightly more facetious on these things, it was quite fascinating. There was a very well-known journalist that wrote many articles on IT for many years, called Gerald Haig, and he sadly passed away from cancer, I think probably a couple of years ago now. But interestingly, because he was such a well-known figure, his Facebook page, his daughter still publishes to periodically, almost to keep the work that he did and the memory of him alive. And she posted a letter written to him, 2 different letters written to him by Roald Dahl. And she commented on a post how pretty scruffy Roald Dahl's handwriting was. So I think there is a context here about, I'm not advocating scruffy writing. What I'm advocating is there is a place for developing fine motor skills, good communication skills. Nice handwriting is pleasing to see, but there's a place for digital skills to sit alongside that, and it's a different way of working. You know, I sat in a meeting the other day. I very rarely write, but I drew a little sketch about a building plan. And I could have picked up the digital ink and did it, but someone offered me his notepad. The person who offered me his notepad then picked up his mobile phone and photographed it, because he then took a digital image to go and do something with it. And I think what you're seeing is a seamless movement between the different skills in an appropriate situation, and the children take to that more naturally than we as adults. We tend to find our route, what we're comfortable with, and that's what we stick with. Actually, giving the children the range of tools and the range of opportunities, they take to it much more seamlessly. So I know that's a long answer to what could have been a simple answer of, I think that, you know, you're not losing anything, but I think it's a more complex answer than digital inking is right or wrong.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you. Do you think, because that's from kind of the student's point of view, really, what about things like assessment? Because obviously you, as a teacher, you do have to provide assessments. Do you think there's any problem with saying that the work that the students are doing is available electronically, it's available in the notebooks, not on paper? Do you think that would cause a problem, for example, with Ofsted if they came in and saw it?
I think the answer is yes. It does cause a challenge for us, and it's one that we're very aware of. And I think particularly with the pendulum swings, you can have a pendulum swing that we've had that it's very focused on outcomes in reading, writing and maths, and the progress measures judged by one SAT to another SAT test. Actually, we're in a climate now where we're suddenly going, what about the broader curriculum? What about the development of well-being and attitudes in learning? And some of those territories of what we used to call 21st century learning and problem-solving skills are coming back to realise that they're really critical in being blended along with traditional learning. So when we went away from levels nationally, obviously there was a very keen focus on the books. So work scrutinies, half-termly data drops, teacher judgments, triple marking, response to marking. And that was very predicated not on digital inking, electronic working. It certainly was not about collaborative team working and shared outcomes. And I think those challenges are still here and are here to stay for a period of time. But again, for me, balance is always the challenge of life. Balance in your diet, but of anything. You know, McDonald's every night, some have argued is pretty bad for you. I think McDonald's occasionally, some might not do, but I quite enjoy. And I think that in the context of assessment, you don't want to be assessing all the time because you're weighing the pig, not feeding the pig, as the expression goes. You want accurate assessment, and if you're going to judge a teacher by outcomes that are very narrowed and say that's the hoop to jump through, they're going to jump through it. So if you really want an assessment process that is going to look at those wider skills and those attitudinal things, you can't just rely on reading, writing and arithmetic. You need balance in your curriculum. So there's a place to learn some basic skills and to be tested on your knowledge of those skills. But if that's all you do, that's all you're going to have. So the challenge of good quality teaching has never changed. How do you get balance in the breadth of your curriculum whilst going for the depth of knowledge and understanding? How do you ensure that there's a good recall of key facts whilst not just building knowledgeable children that can't interact and socialise and solve a problem. If you spend all day solving a problem, but don't understand the core concepts and knowledge, they can't solve the problem. And therefore, the challenge of digital evidence versus booked evidence is going to be a challenge moving forwards. And in a short inspection with a limited amount of time, you've got to be really key to be able to put on the table for them the equivalence of the books. You can't just say, oh, it's there, it's in the cloud, or it's in OneNote. You've got to be able to say, you've selected these 12 children's books. I'm going to give you these books, and I'm going to give you these 12 children's personal areas that have got that evidence bank on it, and I can give you the 12 assessments of how we're judging them. And I think we're in a good place for that, because actually they are looking for evidence of the breadth of the curriculum. They're not any longer just seeing it as about the books. We're moving from that. They've realised that teacher workload was impossible when you had every piece being marked in depth with response to marking in 14 different colours. Actually, if you really want to get an iterative process of improvement, the blend from maybe paper into digital and sometimes back to paper is a route we may all take. And so being able to evidence the steps of learning, not evidence how good was my marking in different colours and their response to it and the impact of it. Marking is about feedback. And I find some of the most powerful tools for feeding back to children are the digital tools, where you can be assessing more effectively with some online quizzes and digital assessments. You can be using video feedback to talk about a piece of work that they can watch and re-watch, and digital inking and commenting features. If you can combine those tools, you get more manageable workloads and more effective feedback that gets better quality outcomes. But you do need to manage that intelligently, because if you can't really show that evidence of impact to an Ofsted inspector, then they're not going to believe you, because they haven't got the evidence base.
Right. So up until recently, class notebooks, they've been a standalone tool for you, but now these are integrating into Microsoft Class Teams. How do you foresee Class Teams being used with students going forwards?
Yeah, so we moved all of our notebooks into Teams, and we're using Teams and assignments within Teams alongside the notebooks embedded. So we haven't taken away the importance of the notebook. What we've added is other layers that support that notebook. So those layers are, first of all, obviously the chat and the dialogue through channels. So having targeted teams with channel dialogue, where the notebook with the resources and the personal areas still exists, has really added a really powerful dialogue between students and between teacher and students on pieces of work and on projects. The second layer of that is assignments. So being able to track where children are, maybe in a more project-driven way, can be harder. So actually being able to say, this is the piece of work, but it might have several stages, and creating an assignment with some deadlines, you can help track and manage the journey through that broader project with some clear deadlines and steps using assignments. I then think you've got the other elements of Teams, which are the communication aspects and the collaborative aspects. So having video calling, as we're doing today through Teams, but then the shared file areas that allow simultaneous collaborative editing is bringing, as it were, the structure of individual assignments with high quality resources into a more collaborative, team driven approach. So I actually think, for me, Teams is building upon OneNote, not replacing it, but is really transforming and empowering that collaborative approach that is about the 21st century learning skills. It's about the real workplace. It's around how adults work and allowing children to work in that way.
Great. Have you had a look at within using assignments in Teams, and when you use the class notebook pages to set the assignments, have your teachers done anything with comparative assessment there? Because one of the things that I noticed that you can do quite well is once you're in an assignment and you're marking, you can move between the work of different students very quickly, whether that's previewing a Word document that those students have each returned, or whether that's looking at the class notebook page that you've pushed out and students are working on their each area. Do you find that would help with the way that assessments are done, because you can very quickly compare one student within the class to another?
Yeah, so sort of for us, our strategy around assessment, we have used a lot of standardized assessments alongside, and they're done infrequently and they're done online in a more quiz base. So it's not about a high pressure testing environment. What that's enabling you to do is really identify where progress isn't happening and target areas where more support might be required. The next step for us on that was we've begun the journey of working with No More Marking, which is an organisation based on research, which is using comparative judgments to really generate a standardised score. And so that, for me, is proving to be very accurate against what the teacher judgments were, and it is allowing that speedier identification of those children that are needing more support and giving more timely, relevant feedback. And so I think the principles of comparative judgments within marking, I'm finding to be a good principle. And OneNote, as you've described, and the assignments tool is really allowing that to happen. I also think where you can use those comparative judgments to start to note trends, and you see that a piece of work is an iterative process. So you start with your first draft, and then you want to not just say, right, here's a bit of feedback, go do it again. You want to start to scaffold and give a structure to that improvement. So we've got what we've called brace maps, but we've got a process of feeding back to children on that improvement process. So I think combining comparative judgments with a structured improvement process, Teams and OneNote, I think really lend themselves as tools to enable teachers to do that.
Great. On that same topic of perhaps reducing the marked workload for teachers, have you used the quizzes within the Teams assignments yet? Can you see that being used for the auto-marked quizzes, so multiple choice? Do you think that would that save teacher time?
I think so. I mean, that's not new, that concept. I think in a lot of VLEs, the auto marking has been good there. I think it has a limited place in terms of for certain things in certain activities. That's not knocking it, because it has a place. I do feel, though, that the danger of it is it will lend you to a more knowledge-based closed activity if you're not careful, and that's why I say it has a place, because to learn something, to learn it by rote, to test someone on it is needed in life, and there are some core pieces of knowledge in any of the subjects that you go, we've been learning about this, it's really good if you could retain that information, and that quiz would be a good way of checking and testing. I wouldn't want to see that, though, as something that could take many hours of teachers' time designing them to a good quality, maybe for little impact on the improvement and the problem solving and the collaborative working. So got a place, but not the be all and end all for us as a school.
So the kind of mix then, if I'm understanding that you'd perhaps advocate, is almost kind of a funnel that gets wider, and you'd start off with knowledge-based questions. You might use something like the quizzes for that. And then as you move outwards, then you'd start to do short bursts of perhaps free text within the class notebooks, where students work on individual small pages. And then perhaps as they develop and they become project-based work, then you might start using perhaps Word documents or PowerPoints that are more extended and do it that way.
I guess, absolutely. The only thing I would say in response to that is I'd put it the other way, because actually the key to project-based learning, to coin that expression, is you start at the end. It's purposeful learning, it's outcome driven. And so what you have to do is visualize and see that end goal, that end product. And then you say, right, well, how am I going to achieve that? And then you break it down and work your way backwards almost. So you're backfilling rather than working your way backwards. So in order to achieve this end goal, I need some knowledge. Then we're going to go and find that knowledge. And then we're going to use that knowledge to help inform my decision making, which is going to help me crack that problem. So it's probably a bit of start at the end, work it backwards, but then work it forwards. And that actually, I think, is how we all attack a challenge and a problem when we're confronted with it. You have to see what the end goal is before it can work back. And the almost unintended consequence of that style of learning is higher engagement. And higher engagement results in more talk, deeper thinking, and better behaviour. And often in school, we start at the other end of, we've got a behaviour policy and we expect you to come in and learn this information so that one day you can use it. And that doesn't have a lot of purpose, and bored children become badly behaved. And so I've learned along this journey of a lot of one-to-one access to computers. Giving them a computer won't make them well behaved. Giving them purposeful learning matched to their needs and supporting them on that learning journey can transform behaviour and engagement in children, because they are able to do what they're doing, they're being successful at it, and they're loving it. And so the curriculum and the outcome is important, and the tools of OneNote and the tools of Teams and the assessments and the assignments have to be seen in that broader pedagogy of the curriculum.
So you've recently built an intranet for the Cornerstone Academy, which is fairly new and in many ways still being developed. And that's using SharePoint Online within Office 365. How do you see that benefiting schools and individuals within the Trust?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey because, you wouldn't know it looking at me, but 25 years in teaching. I think we've been through many iterations of websites, intranets, VLEs, in all different guises. And actually the management of this, setting up of them, the management of them and keeping them current is always a challenge. And it comes down to having time to achieve it. I think the beauty of SharePoint that often has been overlooked and has been hard to manage is it's an out-of-the-box product that almost sits there in the background. So it is empowering all of Office 365 and OneDrive and things like that. So the almost portal entry, the front entry, can be bypassed through the app or the application. So we went on that journey going, look, we're working in OneNote, we're putting all this content into OneNote. But what we found was that some of those notebooks became very unmanageable in their size and structure and randomness. And what you'd then end up looking at is how you give password permissions to certain sections and who's a member of it. We then found that Teams would help with some of this information. But what you can end up with is so many teams and so many channels and so many chat lines that we started to find that organizing those groups of people and teams effectively with that information, how do you catalog and search and find it? So actually where we've come back to is with yourselves, let's redesign that intranet within SharePoint, but it's not a static intranet of just putting up some information pages. It is about that versioning control, multi-collaboration on documents. But for me, it's that resource bank, that policy site that is allowing the collaborative working to ensure that it stays current. So everybody is working, seeing what they have permissions to see in a targeted way, but then able to collaborate in uploading and managing those documents. So we're seeing this from policies to curriculum resources, and they almost transcend the academic years. Whereas the teams and the notebooks are about the engagement in that school year, but are tied back to those resources. So it is new. It is something that what we're trying to do is, having built through yourselves that easy to access, attractive interface, is working as, we've got a drive team. You can have, it's a posh name, isn't it? But a digital drive team, which for me is about looking at new initiatives, looking at how we will deploy and disseminate that across a small but growing trust with a growing number of teachers and employees. But then how do you get that change in culture and way of working to get the very best out of it? And what you can find is, if someone knows that notebook and that's where they work, that's what they do. They know what they know and work in that way. So the biggest challenge of the intranet is defining what should go there versus what should be in a notebook versus what should be in a shared OneDrive. And who's responsible for uploading, managing, working on it? And how do you change then that culture to say this is a door into that world that would really make my workload more efficient, easier to find, better cataloging, better versioning control on those documents that would cut the volume of email, the volume of chat, because it's in a collaborative page. I think we're at the beginning of that journey, even though, as I've described, we've probably been on that journey for 20 years, but I think we're back on it because it's a new iteration of what is probably a really, really powerful tool, but is underused in Office 365.
Well, I know that we're looking forward to working with you on that, and hopefully at some point you'll be able to come back and chat to us again about what some of those answers are on this quest. Jonathan, thank you very much for taking the time to see us today, and for the very interesting conversation that we've had.
It's been lovely chatting to you. Sorry my answers aren't always short, but there's a lot to talk about when you're using tools that underpin your curriculum. So thank you for all the support you've given us and are giving us. And happy to come back and chat with you again.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Jonathan.